Good morning. My name is Cuffy Chase, and as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Brunswick, Maine, I'm happy to welcome you to our service this morning. Today is Sunday, August 8th, 2021. Today our service is led by Reverend Erika Hewitt and is entitled Origin Stories. Reverend Hewitt, pronoun she, her, lives in Bath, where her ministry spans two different realms. She serves the Unitarian Universalist Association as Minister of Worship Arts, overseeing liturgical resources for Unitarian Universalist individuals and congregations around the world. In helping to shape and transform the denomination's worship life, Erika's recent focus is the necessary and urgent dismantling of systems of oppression. In addition to her institutional leadership, Erika also has an extensive pastoral ministry as a wedding officiant. At any given moment, she's mentoring dozens of couples across the country who want their formal commitment to one another expressed in meaningful, spirit-filled ways here in Maine. In this role, Erika also teaches seminarians and new ministers how to create and lead rites of passage. Our charity with soul for August is Tedford Housing. At the core of all of Tedford Housing's programs and services is case management, ensuring every client they serve has access to all of the health, human, and community services needed to address the challenges that created their housing emergency. Today, Tedford Housing finds itself serving more people in the community on an outreach basis than it does in its facilities. They have become a resource center for our homeless and at-risk neighbors, much more than a shelter with emergency beds. Please give generously, and now enjoy the service.
Good morning and welcome to worship. Welcome to this virtual Unitarian Universalist gathering where we lift up questions, we lift up our values, we lift up the importance of connecting to each other and all that we have promised to do as a people. I'm the Reverend Erika Hewitt. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am honored to be the guest in your virtual pulpit this morning. Our service is a little different than what you might be used to. That's because the service is a collection of 5 origin stories. I'll be telling 2 of them, and then Stephanie, Louise, and Reverend Lucy will each be telling one. You're going to be hearing from people with marginalized identities. You will be hearing truths lifted up by people like Glennon Doyle and people like Ijeoma Oluo. You'll be hearing stories lifted up by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and she, in fact, is the source of today's guiding text. This is the thought that is the gateway and the endpoint of today's exploration. Let me read you that guiding text. Origin narratives form the vital core of a people's unifying identity and of the values that guide them. Origin narratives. You know, sometimes origin narratives have drifted from the truth, and they demand that we tell a more truthful story. And sometimes origin stories get buried and we don't know about them. And when we tell and retell those stories, it grounds us in values worth celebrating. So I hope that you enjoy these 5 stories and the way that we have put them together for you. Before we sing our first hymn, I invite you, if you're near a window, to look out, to connect to the larger world around you. I'm recording this on a late summer day as the moon wanes down to a new moon. I'm looking out at green maple leaves, signs of life rustling in the branches. I'm looking out at a world that contains beauty and hurt, that reminds me that there's much to celebrate and there's much repair that we're capable of. So however you are connecting to the world in all of its beauty and pain, I welcome you again to this morning where we have much to explore. It's so good to be together. Most Unitarian Universalists know that the way we begin our services is by lighting a chalice. And you might even know where the chalice comes from, where the symbol of our flaming chalice comes from. So whether your chalice looks something like this, or whether you have a much more unusual chalice, or whether you have a really unusual chalice, like this beeswax chalice made from an abandoned shell of a turtle. No turtles were harmed in the making of this chalice. I invite you to have a chalice nearby to light at the end of this story, because I'm hoping that the story has a much And the act of lighting a chalice has a much more deeper meaning. The Unitarian Service Committee was established in 1940. It was established to continue and formalize humanitarian service in World War II Europe, and its commissioner was Reverend Charles Joy. By the mid-1940s, the strength of Nazi Germany had grown, huge and looming, taking severe tolls on human life throughout Europe. And not enough was being done to assist the thousands of people attempting to flee the danger of Nazi occupation. In fact, Lisbon, Portugal, was the only open port in Europe, and millions of refugees were pouring in. From his headquarters in Lisbon, Reverend Charles Joy oversaw a secret network of couriers and agents who helped provide identification papers and travel documents that would allow those refugees to escape fascism and reach for freedom. But the Unitarian Service Committee was an unknown organization, and that put them at a disadvantage in the wartime environment. Establishing trust across barriers of language and nationality and faith could mean life instead of death. So Reverend Joy realized that he needed a symbol for the papers issued by the service committee to make those papers look recognizable and to dignify them. He explained, when a document may keep someone out of jail, give them standing with governments and police, it's important that it look important. And so he asked Hans Deutsch, an Austrian refugee, an artist working in Lisbon, to create an emblem for the committee. And the result was essentially the flaming chalice as we know it today, although like our faith itself, the flaming chalice symbol has evolved over time. It took over 2 decades for the chalice to transform from a 2-dimensional drawing into the 3-dimensional object that we use in worship. And nobody is really sure how the chalice made it into a worship service as an act, but what we do know is that chalices were lit in Unitarian Universalist worship services for the first time on Sundays when the children and youth of our congregations were leading worship and demonstrated that practice to the adults. So if you have a chalice at home, I invite you to light it. Maybe you have Faithify matches. I invite you to think about how the symbol of our chalice for years symbolized safety and freedom, compassion and help to people who are frightened. How it through time evolved, thanks to children and youth, to a beloved ritual that we hold in worship. And how the chalice is now an image and an act that unites Unitarian Universalists around the world.
When our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed.
Almost everyone watching this service, especially those of you who have been part of 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous or Al-Anon, knows the prayer known as the Serenity Prayer. It goes like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. What you probably don't know is that prayer came into being at almost exactly the same time that the Unitarian Service Committee had the Chalice logo created, and for a fairly similar reason. What I'm about to tell you a lot of it comes from Elizabeth Sifton's book, The Serenity Prayer, Faith and Politics in Times of Peace and War. Elizabeth Sifton is the daughter of Reinhold Niebuhr. Let me tell you about Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr was rare for his time because he was a political activist, especially prominent in the middle of the 1900s. As Europe descended into war in the 1940s, Reinhold Niebuhr was one of the few clergy in the United States to denounce anti-Semitism. He had academic friends and pastor colleagues in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, who were doing their best to help Jews flee Nazi prosecution, and some of them fell under fascist prosecution themselves. Niebuhr came to be a leading advocate for U.S. entry into World War II. In his daughter's words, Niebuhr believed that religious faith is supposed to strengthen, not abandon, people suffering the extremities of horror. The question is how to behave responsibly in an evil, morally ambiguous, and compromised world where things were getting immeasurably worse. The question was how to act and when. Yet many clergy never even asked the question. And so it was in 1943, when it was still very unclear that the Allies would win the brutal war, that Niebuhr composed a prayer for Sunday worship service intended to address the pain and loss inflicted by war. And here is the version that he offered. God, give us the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things that should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish one from the other. Now, what you can hear in that prayer is a theological tension at the heart of Niebuhr's ethics. He had a realistic view of human nature. He did not turn away from the worst of what we can do to one another as members of the human family. He did not numb out. Niebuhr believed in the roots of evil in human life, but he also trusted in the good that we're capable of. He did not believe that we're just pawns being shuffled around by a divine hand, but that we are God's hands on earth. We are channels for change. We are justice makers, all of us anointed and ordained to create the kingdom of the holy, the beloved community in the here and now. And so if there is suffering in the world, personal or systemic, we are its antidote. We are its balm. And as the prayer suggests, the trick is distinguishing when the circumstances cry out for us to act and when to keep faith with appropriate powerlessness. I invite you, as we prepare for just some quiet time together, a devotional time of being aware of your own struggles, the choices that you make about courage and acceptance. I invite you to pray one of these two prayers out loud with me. So I am going to recite first the prayer that we know in modern times, and then Reinhold Niebuhr's original prayer. And then I'm going to allow us to enter into some silence, and you will see the prayers on the screen so that you can read it silently to yourself or out loud wherever you are in that silence. First, would you join me in softening your shoulders and your breath? And maybe let yourself become aware of the past week and any tension or struggles or fear you've encountered. Maybe you even close your eyes. And breathing into the place in your body that knows peace, I offer you this prayer in both of its forms. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things that should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Let us be together in silence for a minute or so that you can sift through your current life experiences and choose one of them to wrap this prayer around. Let's be together in that place of inner work and inner process, which is a form of prayer. May we be at ease with the secret struggles that we carry and our choices about how to carry them. May we find ways to comfort and support ourselves when we don't know what to do. And may this prayer, with its origin story rooted in speaking up out against injustice, may this prayer live in us in a different way so that we can appreciate it anew the next time we encounter it.
Tiny beginnings are hid from our sight. Miracles, spinnings are dreamers and lovers as one, building community, striving to find systems to live by and structures to bind nations and continents, cultures and ways, bordered by differences, share the same days, planets revolving from morning to night, millions of souls ride from darkness to light, orbits elliptical circle the sun, yet in the nebula we are but one, galaxy shining where time cannot trace, dwarfed by the concept of never-ending space, tiny beginnings are yet from our sight, miracle spendings of infinite might, joined in a moment that cannot be named, filled with a power that cannot be framed.
The next three stories that you're going to hear, thanks to Louise and Stephanie and Reverend Lucy, are a little more difficult for some people than the first two stories that I told you. One reason it's crucial to tell these stories, however, is because as Unitarian Universalists, we have made a commitment to dismantle systems of oppression. That includes white supremacy culture. And that means sometimes, especially those of us who are white, we need to undo and unravel the stories we've been taught and listen to Indigenous voices, the voices of people of color, who have more truthful stories to remind us of and to teach us. You're about to hear one story from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People of the History of the United States. And then you'll hear an origin story that's taken from Ijeoma Oluo's book, So You Want to Talk About Race. These are fantastic, important, engrossing books. And if you, like me, are white, and you carry a lot of other forms of privileged identity, it can be difficult to hear these stories. If you notice discomfort rising in you, I invite you to take a breath, to notice that it's uncomfortable, and to be willing to connect these stories to the values and promises that we have professed as Unitarian Universalists, as one people trying to get as many people free as possible as part of this liberatory faith. Thank you again to Stephanie, to Louise, and to Reverend Lucy for telling our next three stories.
Our third origin story was compiled by Reverend Erika and is about the United States. In the words of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in An Indigenous People's History of the United States, the history of the United States is a history of settler colonialism, the founding of a state based on the ideology of white supremacy, the widespread practice of African slavery, and a policy of genocide and land theft. The very existence of the country is a result of the looting of an entire continent and its resources. In her stunning book, which was our 2019-2020 UUA Common Read, Dunbar Ortiz reminds us of how religious zeal, white supremacy, and the unique notion of land as public property converged to create, quote, a willingness to eliminate whole civilizations of people, unquote. Settler colonialism is inherently genocidal, she reminds us, and yet, the absence of even the slightest note of regret or tragedy in the annual celebration of the U.S. independence, and I would argue Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, betrays a deep disconnect in the consciousness of U.S. Americans. These words of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz echo those of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Here are his words. Our nation was born in genocide. We are perhaps the only nation which tried, as a matter of national policy, to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it. Dr. King was a prophet, an agitator who was able to connect our country's origin and genocide to the anti-Blackness that underlay segregation. Anti-Blackness and white supremacy never went away. They only changed form, often slipping beneath the notice of white Americans.
Our fourth origin story is a brief reminder of how the modern police force has its roots in white supremacy. One of the most evident forms that anti-Blackness takes today is police brutality. Ijoma Oluo devotes a chapter to this in her book, So You Want to Talk About Race. These are the words of Ijoma Oluo. There has not been a time in American history where our police force has not had a contentious and often violent relationship with communities of color. Our police forces were born from night patrols, who had the principal task of controlling Black and Native American populations in New England, and slave patrols, who had the principal task of catching escaped Black slaves and sending them back to slave masters. After the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, catching and re-enslaving Black people became the job of night patrols as well, and that job was continued on after the night patrols were turned into the country's first police forces. Our early American police forces existed not only to combat crime, but also to return Black Americans to slavery and control and intimidate free Black populations. Our police force was not created to serve Black Americans. It was created to police Black Americans and serve white Americans. Our police forces were created not to protect Americans of color, but to control Americans of color. It is understandable then that the fear and mistrust of police are also woven throughout the history of communities of color, especially Black America. The trauma from police brutality has been felt over multiple generations. The generational wounds of police brutality and oppression have not healed because the brutality and oppression is still happening, even if cops are no longer wearing white hoods or letting their attack dogs loose on us.
Flows on in endless song above earth's lamentation. I hear the real, though far off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? tempest round me roars, I know the truth, it liveth. But though the darkness round me close, songs in the night it giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging. Since love prevails in heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? When tyrants tremble as they hear the bells of freedom ringing, when friends rejoice both far and near, how can I keep from singing? To prison cell and dungeon vile, our thoughts to them are winging. When friends by shame are undefiled, how can I keep?
Origin story number 5, the religious right. Our final origin story speaks to the undeniable and persistent truth that the personal is political, because politics have real effects on our most personal choices and our private lives. You might have wondered, with a mixture of outrage and bewilderment, how the control of women's bodies and our reproductive freedom became the hinge on which an entire radical conservative movement swings. There is perhaps no better explanation than the narrative delivered by Glennon Doyle in her recent memoir, Untamed. These are the words of Glennon Doyle explaining this history. In the 1970s, a few rich, powerful, white, outwardly straight men got worried about losing their right to continue racially segregating their private Christian schools and maintaining their tax-exempt status. Those men began to feel their money and power being threatened by the civil rights movement. In order to regain control, they needed to identify an issue that would be emotional and galvanizing enough to unite and politically activate their evangelical followers for the first time. They decided to focus on abortion. Before then, a full 6 years after the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision, the prevailing evangelical position was that life began with the baby's first breath, at birth. Most evangelical leaders had been indifferent to the court's decision in Roe, and some were cited as supporting the ruling. Not anymore. They wrote a new memo using freshly feigned outrage and rhetoric, calling for, quote, a holy war to lead the nation back to the moral stance that made America great, unquote. They sponsored a meeting of 15,000 pastors called the Religious Roundtable to train pastors on how to convince their congregations to vote for anti-choice, anti-gay candidates. This is how they disseminated the memo down to evangelical ministers who passed it down to pews across America. The memo read, to be aligned with Jesus, to have family values, to be moral, one must be against abortion and gay people and vote for the candidate that is anti-abortion and anti-gay. The presidential candidate, Ronald Reagan, who, as governor of California, had signed into law one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country, began using the language from the new memo. Evangelicals threw their weight behind him and voted in a bloc for the first time to elect President Reagan. The religious right was born. The face of the movement was the pro-life and pro-family value stance of millions, but the blood running through the movement's veins was the racism and greed of a few. That is how white evangelicals became the most powerful and influential voting bloc in the United States and the fuel of the American white supremacy engine. That is also why all a political candidate must do to earn evangelical allegiance is claim to be anti-abortion and anti-gay, even if the candidate is a man who hates and abuses women, who stockpiles money and rejects immigrants, who incites racism and bigotry, who lives in every way antithetical to Jesus' teachings. Jesus, the cross, the identity pro-life are just shiny decals evangelical leaders slap on top of their own interests. They just keep pushing the memo. Don't think, don't feel, don't know. Just be against abortion and gays and keep on voting. That is how to live like Jesus. All the devil has to do to win is convince you he is God.
We have heard 5 origin stories this morning. Maybe all of them were new to you. We heard about where our image and practice of the flaming chalice come from. We learned about the roots of what is known as the Serenity Prayer, created amidst a peak of Nazi prosecution. We heard about the origins of what we call the United States and the pain and genocide that lie at the root of our national identity. We heard about the roots of law enforcement and how the terrorizing and controlling of Black bodies is at the root of today's practices. And we heard about the origins of the evangelical religious right seizing on the control of women's reproductive agency as a prime plank in their political platform. Were any of these stories shocking to you? Are any of them upsetting? Do any of these 5 stories stir you in some way, or inspire you, or provoke you? One of our core values as Unitarian Universalists is the right and the responsibility to always redefine truth and to craft meaning out of the raw material and building blocks that we're given. The question I leave you with this morning is, how might any of this new information inform your actions in the coming days? How might this new information empower you to use your freedom to free someone else? Because as Toni Morrison reminded us, the function of freedom is to free someone else. Do you understand in a new way the guiding text that we began with? I'm going to read it to you one more time. Origin narratives form the vital core of a people's unifying identity and of the values that guide them. How has your identity or how have your values changed, if only slightly, by hearing any of these 5 stories? I'd like to ask you to come with me into a moment of prayer to close our service. Before I offer a prayer, I want to offer you another quote from Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr said, Prayer does not change things, prayer changes people, and people change things. Prayer is not hearing voices, prayer is acquiring a voice. And so I'm going to hold this chalice as I offer these words of prayer. Holy mystery, sometimes you wrap us in comfort and love, and sometimes you trouble the waters, because sometimes our hearts need to be awakened and troubled, and sometimes they simply need to be held and consoled. For all who are entering this service or are here with lamentation and grief, may they not be afraid to reach out and ask for the comfort, the compassion, and the care they need to remember that they are not alone, and may they remember how deeply loved they are. For all of us who have tuned out, gone numb, or failed to stay awake to injustice and hatred in the world, may our spirits be revived. May our resolve be lit up so that we never forget the power that we have and the importance of using it. And for all who came today with curiosity, a wanting to know more, a wanting to go deeper, may they have received some pieces of the puzzle today to put together in new and more faithful ways. Amen. And I extinguish our chalice. You can extinguish yours at home as we go from this place, knowing who we are, whose we are, and what we are called to do in the world. Go in peace.